Yes.
Oh, okay.
I know we have 51 so far on this call. We're expecting more, so we'll just start in just a moment. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I see some familiar names. Happy Wednesday. If you are not on mute, if you could mute yourself. Happy Wednesday, everybody. I'll just get started. And again, if you want to, enter your name in the chat, say hi from where you are. Thank you for joining us again today. My name is Jesse Lee. I serve as the ACCA board president this year. And again, it is my honor and pleasure to really invite you to be part of today's conversation. Before we get started, I certainly want to thank a few folks. And again, these folks are just amazing folks. And again, I just cannot we can't do this without them. I want to start off with Darren Otten. Darren is president of Copper Mountain College. Thank you so much, Darren, for taking on this important coordination leadership role. It's great to have you on board. And I want to also recognize Sarah Schrader. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah is the VP of Admin Services at Modesto Junior College. Thank you, Sarah, for being so awesome and again pinch hitting when we asked you to step into this role to help out as well. I also want to acknowledge Alex Coretti. Alex is our operations person behind the scenes. Alex, thank you so much for doing everything you can to really get the word out, promote this, and of course, make this happen today. Certainly, I want to acknowledge our four panelists before we turn it over to them in a little moment. Again, Kodeep Kaur is going to join us today when we have our breakout. Kodeep is the Vice Chancellor for Administrative Services at Yuba Community College District. We have Jane Kwan, VP Student Services at Copper Mountain College. Thank you, Jane, for joining us. Jedediah Lobos. Jedediah is Dean of Math, Science, and Engineering at Antelope Valley College. Thank you, Jedediah, for being one of our facilitators. And Carla Tweet. Carla is the president of Coalinga College. Thank you, Carla, for joining us as well. Certainly, we have an amazing economic forecast presentation. I'm not going to take too long to introduce very soon Clement Boer from the UCLA Anderson forecast organization. So thank you again for joining us, Clement. Again, I'll turn it over to you very soon. For the folks on the call, we are going to record this, so you will get a recording. If you want to watch it again and again, please know that you will be getting the recording soon. I just want to briefly go over the agenda for today. Again, I will stop talking in just a moment. But again, we're going to turn it over first with our forecast, economic forecast. Then Darren Otten is going to again introduce the panelists, and we're going to go into budget impact conversations. As you know, we are trying to better understand, make meaning of Governor Newsom's proposed budget for this year. So this is really a great time to understand what it means, especially for community colleges and the impact at your college level, district level. So again, we're going to have some great conversations in terms of what this looks like. And again, folks will share insights. Please, if you're in the audience, ask questions. Please engage when we have our breakout session. Again, we want this to be a very invaluable learning opportunity so that you can learn more about the budget, especially if you're not the chief business officer, especially if you're just, again, student services dean or, an academic affairs dean or somebody in HR. It's important to understand the budget impact for this calendar year. Okay. Again, the format's very, very simple. We're going to have a quick break after the breakout session at 11 o'clock, and then we're going to have report out. And then, of course, we're going to end with advocacy strategy conversations. How do we sort of advocate for our students? How do we advocate for our colleges and districts? And how do we navigate this landscape? So without further ado, I want to say thank you for joining us today. Again, I want to make sure that Clement our economic forecast presentation gets the entire duration. So Clement, thank you so much for joining us from UCLA-ish area, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Jesse. And here, let me just share my screen and share my slides. I want to say on behalf of myself, as well as on behalf of UCLA Anderson Forecast, we're really thrilled to do this for you guys. We do a lot of these type of economic outlook talks, and I think somebody needs to mute their microphone in the background. If everybody could mute their microphone. Thank you.
I can listen there and watch. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We're really thrilled to be here. We do a lot of these talks, and we get a lot more joy to do them for other organizations have really helped the state of California and especially educational organizations like ACCA. So we're happy, we're happy we did this last year and we're happy to continue doing it again. And we really hope this will lead to a longer collaboration going forward. So enough of that. What I want to talk about today is the economic outlook for the US and California. That is what we do here at the UCLA Anderson Forecast, which is a center inside the UCLA Anderson School of Management. And as the title here suggests, what I'm really going to be talking about a lot is the implications of AI and tariffs on the US and California economy. So I'm going to start out with this cartoon here that we created with the help of AI. And I want to begin by saying that, just looking at the past 2 weeks, I mean, the news cycle that's happening right now is nuts, right? I mean, we've had what, four history-defining moments already in 2026 with the Iran protests, with the criminal indictment of the Federal Reserve Chair, with the ICE shootings in Minnesota, and the military operations in Venezuela, right? But
Okay.
we're going to try and tune those out. I'm going to tune that out as much as possible here, that it may have implications in the future for the economy, but right now, a lot of that is noise. And what I want to talk about are the three elephants in the room that are shown in this cartoon, which is, first of all, we have tariffs that are on the right here, which are really trying to deflate the economy and put downward pressure on it in the moment. While on the other hand, we have this AI elephant, which represents the big tech firms that are spending a lot on AI investment infrastructure and the technology behind the AI infrastructure that's really doing a lot to stimulate and inflate the economy. So we have these forces that are, pushing in different directions on the US economy. And because of that, we have a Federal Reserve, which is written in the back in the FOMC elephant, that's really having a very hard time figuring out how the heck do you manage this economy and keep the temperature just right in the room with these strong forces going in different directions. And then what happened in the fall makes it even harder, which is that we had the government shutdown, which effectively you can think of as turning the lights out. We don't really know, it can't see what is happening in the economy because the data stopped flowing in. And that government shutdown was very long, it was 43 days. It is over now, but because it was so long, there's real gaps in our knowledge from that time period, and we're actually still working through some of those gaps. We're still missing data since then, and some of the data that's come out after that is still um, is of lower quality, and there's still a lot of missing parts in it that makes it harder to gauge how the economy is doing. And you're going to see that throughout the talk when I'm going to show you guys a lot of data and figures, and I can point out exactly where we're having these data issues still. So I'm going to start out with the tariffs. And what I first want to talk about is that if you go back to early spring of 2025, a lot of economists were really, about to keel over from a heart attack, and people were worrying about a recession and claims like that. And that hasn't unfolded, right? The effects of the tariffs have been smaller than expected. But there's a good reason for that. And that reason is that the tariffs that were put out in the early spring haven't come to be. And that's what I'm showing you here in the figure on the left. So I'm plotting the historical average tariff rate for the US going all the way back to the 1930s. So here we have the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which didn't create the Great Depression, but they certainly contributed to the severity of the Great Depression. All the way up to today, and you see how they became very low. And then the tariffs that were proposed in very light blue, were dramatic, all the way up to above 25% on average for all our imports. And that did not come to be. If you look at the tariffs as of August, which is still where they are about now, the effective statutory tariff rates is really more around 15%. So we did not get that worst case scenario of what we were all worried about back in the spring. And probably part of that was because of the pushback that did happen at that moment. Now, another reason why the tariff effect hasn't been as strong as expected is that even though the statutory tariff rate, or that which you've seen on paper, is actually higher than what the realized tariff effects have been, which you can actually get by looking at the amount of tariff revenue that's come into the government relative to the import value. And you may wonder, like, how can that be? How can the realized tariffs actually be lower than what the law should say? And there is some tax or tariff evasion going on. It's probably very small, and that is illegal. But the real reason why is that there are real ways that firms can actually evade tariffs, at least in the short run. So, for instance, one you may have already heard of is that firms were able to import a lot of their goods before the tariffs came into effect, right? And then use that import inventory and deplete that over time, and thereby, pushing off when they're going to have to pay these tariffs in the next round of imports they're going to have to do. Another way is that you can change the legal framework under or the filing under what your import counts as. So, for instance, one of the only trade agreements that the president still abides by is the USMCA, which is a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, which is the one he negotiated back in his first term in office. And under that trade act, imports from Canada and Mexico, where the majority of that good was actually produced in North America, is allowed to come into the US duty free, thereby without tariffs. And if you go back into 2024, about 38%, I think was the number. So about 40% of imports from Canada were under this duty-free exemption. So basically zero tariffs, right? Well, the number of imports today that are exempt from that are exempt under USMCA and therefore duty-free has actually jumped to 80%. Right. So that's not because we're suddenly importing a lot of other goods from Canada. That's because a lot of the goods that we were importing from Canada last year, even though they technically could count as USMCA compliant, they chose not to fill out all the arduous and costly paperwork and elect to get it certified USMCA compliant because the tariffs were so low that it was more costly to go through that process than just they paid a very minimal tariff that they otherwise probably would have to pay on it. But now that the cost is so big not to have the USMCA compliant, a lot more goods are actually shown to be USMCA compliant because people are actually doing the paperwork. Now, there's actually a third reason which makes the tariff effect even smaller than even what I've said so far, which is that firms have been reluctant to pass through the prices onto consumers. So typically and empirically, we find that usually the majority of the cost of tariffs are passed on to consumer prices. But so far, it's hard to get the real-time data on it, but it's somewhere between 20 and 60% has been passed through to consumers. So there's still more to come of that. That's one thing. But another thing is that that is another reason why prices haven't risen as much as what you would expect it so far when you consider the size of these tariffs that have been imposed. That's not to say that, oh, well, before I get there, as of this morning, and it actually may be happening right now, I'm not sure because I can't check the news, but the Supreme Court is ruling on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the tariffs that are put through that. And I cannot predict how they're going to rule on that, but if they did completely overturn those tariffs, that would cut the statutory tariff rate by as much as half. Now, there probably won't be as clean a ruling. There'll probably be a lot of caveats and nuances, and it'll probably fall somewhere in between. But one thing I do want to point out is that even if it does get overturned, the administration has many other trade acts it can use to impose tariffs as well. So just because it does get overturned, you shouldn't expect, most of the tariffs or half of the tariffs to go away. Yeah. Now, as I said, the tariff effect on prices has been smaller than expected, but it has been there. So what I'm showing you here is to see the inflation rate for the US going back to 2019 using the consumer price index. That's the CPI. And what you see is that we had this large surge in inflation during the post-COVID-19 pandemic. And then since then, it's gradually trended down or perhaps been a little bit flat. So in that, you might say, well, I don't really see the tariff inflation in here. Where is it? Well, that's because you're not splitting up this into the different components where you can actually see what effect where the tariff is having its an effect. So what I'm showing you here is the contributions to the headline inflation rates from goods, food, and energy, which are very exposed to tariffs, versus services in the US economy that are not that exposed to the US tariffs. And you see that there is this growing yellow gap here at the end, which is a lot of the contribution from the tariffs that are directly raising the cost of goods. And so far, the best estimates we have of that come from the Harvard Pricing Lab, and it shows that tariffs have probably contributed about 0.7 percentage points to headline inflation through goods inflation mainly. The other thing you notice is that the services inflation has gradually been trending downwards, right? And that's the good news. And if we didn't have this tariff inflation, we probably would be almost close to our 2% target, which would have been great. But there are also within services some hot pockets. So most of this decline in services inflation we've seen since 2023 mainly comes from housing services. So the cost of rental, owner-occupied rent and renters for new leases, those are more and more coming in line with the pre-pandemic inflation rates and normalizing. But this light blue area, which is services other than housing services, that's still remaining fatter than what it should be. We're still seeing a lot of costs that are rising for car insurance, for healthcare insurance, and the likes, which are not still taking a long time to normalize and are not normalizing as fast as the economy needs it to. Now, one thing I want to point out here, you see that there's a gap at the end. That's October, where we have missing data. And then we have the November data, which came out recently. And that's due to the government shutdown. The November data here is also very unusual. Both you can see it in its size. It looks a little bit awkward relative to the other ones. And there are a lot of data caveats in that that really mean that it's a bad presentation of how the economy is doing. For instance, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that puts the data together basically had to say, well, for the most recent month of November, they didn't have data on the on rent inflation for housing, and so they just said by the handbook of what they needed to do, they just put in 0% rather than the 3, 4, 5% of what it was running at the time. And so because of issues like that, that really suppressed the headline inflation rate for the month of November lower than what it most likely really is. And so that's one issue we have where we really can't see what the exact actual inflation rate is right now because the data we have currently is still flawed due to the government shutdown. Another way the tariff is having an effect is on the labor market. Now, you probably are all well aware from your own life and from talking with other people that the labor market has been not been doing too well over the last year or so. And the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, calls this a curious kind of balance because not only has labor demand growth, or the increase in the jobs declined over time, but labor supply growth has done too. And so that's what I'm showing you here on the right plot. And I don't want you to get bogged down in all the different colors. What I'm showing you on there's two bar charts for each time period, and you see the left one is the labor supply growth. So that's the increase in the new workers that are entering the workforce and also the labor force participation rate. So how many of our people in our population are actually choosing to work in the economy? And on the right hand, we have the labor demand. That's the amount of jobs that the firms actually want to hire from the different sectors of the economy. And you see that since 2023, both of these have sort of declined together. And what I want you to point out and focus on is this light blue bubble, which is the foreign-born population that is adding to the labor supply. And you see in 2025, that just disappeared. Right. So that is that the immigration really has been completely shut out. Deportations are actually pushing people out. And so that's restricting the labor supply at the same time that the labor demand is also falling, meaning that we are in this curious kind of balance, even though the labor market is not doing too hot, it's not falling apart because both of these forces are actually falling at the same time. Um, to call it a balance, though, is a bit of a positive swing, especially if you look at the second half of 2025, which we don't have data on here yet. And we know that it's not really a balance because it's deteriorating, right? And when we see that because the unemployment rate has been rising and it's risen from 4 to 4.4% in 2025, it peaked at 4.5% in November. And crucially, right now, there's actually less job openings or job vacancies in the US economy than there are unemployed people looking to fill those jobs. So far through 2025, as the economy has cooled, what's that really led to is it's led to fewer firms hiring, not more firms laying off people. But now that that hiring rate has gotten so low, if there's further cooling in the economy, that's really going to lead to firms having to lay off people instead because they can't just they can't keep hiring fewer people when they're already not hiring anyone. And so that's why we're actually at a very fragile moment for the labor market, and that if it gets much worse than where it is right now, it could start spiraling necessarily as people get laid off. That really puts downward pressure on the U.S. economy. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in the outlook, but that's not what we're expecting to happen. We actually think things are going to turn around and look better in 2026. So I don't want to scare you guys, but I do want to point out that we are at a bit at a fragile moment in the labor market. Um, and one reason that it's a little bit confusing what's happening with the US economy right now is that even though the labor market has deteriorated significantly over the 2025, GDP growth has actually been quite strong. And so I'm not showing you headline GDP growth right here. What I'm showing you instead in black is what I'm calling core GDP growth, which takes out the very volatile imports and exports and change in inventories we've seen over this year because of the trade policies, which really do a lot of obscuring of makes it hard to get into a sense of what the underlying growth in the economy is because those parts are so volatile. And so instead we can strip those out and just look at the core parts of GDP and see how that's growing. And I don't want you to get bogged down in the whole chart. I just want you to look at the 2025 bars here where you have the black is in core GDP. You see in the beginning of 2025, it did go a bit lower from 2023 and 2024, and that was concerning. And particularly you see that the blue charts, the bar charts here that make up this core GDP, or part of it, that represents the consumption part, and that was very weak in the beginning of 2025. However, at the same time, we had these very large yellow bar charts, which very much compensated for the time. And those yellow bar charts is investment into high tech, right? That is the data centers being built out to support the new AI revolution, the building of the microchip factories in California and Arizona and the likes, right? And so we were very lucky in a sense because we didn't have this significant economic stimulus from this AI investment because consumption growth was so low. The economy would have been growing much slower if not, basically stagnating if we didn't have that. And you see that AI investment is still continuing. It's also very strong in the second quarter of 2025. Another way AI boosted consumption is actually later on. If you look at both, it's 2025 Q3, and it's looking like the fourth quarter 2025, the official data is not out yet, but it's going to look probably very similar to 2025 Q3, is that now consumption is growing strongly again. And one reason why consumption and people is growing strongly again and people are actually spending is because of the high stock valuations due to the AI stocks essentially, which have very high valuations for the promise of the future productivity growth and economic growth that they're going to provide. And you may say, well, how does that actually boost consumption? And it comes from what the economists like to call the wealth effect. So when people become wealthier and they see it in their, financial portfolio, they feel better about things and they consume more. And so to give you an example, over the last year of 2025, the stock market gained $10 trillion in value. And even just a small wealth effect of say, 3 to 4%, if people increase their consumption or expenditures by 3 or 4% of that total wealth gain, that leads to an increase of more than 1% of GDP just in consumption expenditures. Another way you can see it is through consumer sentiment. So as I mentioned, the labor market has been doing so well, and that's led to really poor consumer sentiment. People are feeling very negative about the economy with high prices and rising unemployment. But there is one segment of the population which actually has seen rising consumer sentiment, and those are the people who have nice, large wealth holdings and stock holdings. So the people who have large holdings in the U.S. stock market, their sentiment has actually been going up over 2025 as they're seeing their assets grow in value. So, so what I've presented to you guys so far should be confusing. And it's putting the Federal Reserve in a very confusing and difficult situation, right? We have inflation rising, which would mean that they would like to raise interest rates to lower that inflation and put downward pressure. But at the same time, we have the labor market gradually deteriorating, which means that they would like to support the economy by lowering interest rates. However, GDP growth is also growing strongly at the same time. How can the economy be growing strongly while the labor market is deteriorating? So there must be a significant productivity growth there, but we also know that the data is noisy and it's going to be revised because of the government shutdown as well. And so the economic data is missing and flawed. And so it's hard to gauge what's really happening. And on top of that, we also have financial markets being exuberant and the Federal Reserve is under immense political pressure. Now, I wrote these slides last week, and I think saying under immense political pressure is a bit of an understatement now. They're actually under direct political attack, which makes it even harder for them to conduct monetary policy, fairly and appropriately to support the economy as best they can. But let me just say that they are by all means in a very difficult position right now, just doing their job in the best way. And so I think we should have a lot of empathy for them and trying to figure out how to best handle this situation. But the question is, what have they decided to do in this under this situation so far? And what they've decided to do is lower interest rates. They cut short-term interest rates by 75 basis points. That's 0.75% over the last fall. And that's what I'm showing you here in black towards the end here. And I don't want to get bogged down in the details behind this graph, but what I'm showing you in this shaded area is the simple prescription for what appropriate interest rates would be at the time as a function of inflation and unemployment and the likes. And so you can see that there's a lot of uncertainty in that. That's because, it's hard to get an exact gauge of what is appropriate for the interest rate. But what I wanted you to point out is for the yellow area, that is only appropriate if you put a lot more weight on the inflation mandate and stable prices. So if you're much more concerned about inflation relative to unemployment, you'd want to raise interest rates higher and you'd think this would be appropriate. And under the blue area, that's for central bankers who are much more concerned about the labor market than they are about the inflation. And so then they would want to lower interest rates more to support the economy relative to that. And what you clearly see here is that we went from being in the gray area, which is sort of a neutral position, turning into what will be the blue area. Right. And so that means that the central bank has clearly turned what you call dovish, is putting much more concern on the labor market and is choosing to stimulate the economy instead, rather than sort of trying to keep a lid on it to make sure inflation is not getting out of hand. So that was the big picture for the US economy. And a lot of that is very relevant to California. But next, I actually want to get into some of the specifics for California, given that that's, where we are and it's also a large part of the US. So, um, and before we get into the nitty-gritty details, I wanted to look at the California GDP growth from the wider perspective and compare that to the US GDP growth in total. So you can see how we compare to the rest of the US. And so I want you to ignore the red line, which is Texas, and just focus on the blue line, which is California, and the black line, which is the United States, where this is GDP growth for these two, the US and California. And if you go back to the 2010s and the late 2010s, it is very representative for what California usually is, which is that it grows faster than the rest of the United States. We have always been the frontier in a sense. People have been moving here since the 1800s that have been boosting GDP growth above the national average. And then more recently, since, the 1970s, we've been the technological frontier, innovating the future. And that's also led to higher GDP growth in California than the rest of the US. But then we had the COVID-19 and the recovery after the COVID-19, which was harder on California than the rest of the economy. And you see that we actually had in blue here negative GDP growth just for California, while the agri economy, slowed, but it didn't actually directly contract. And so there is no terminology for recessions at the state level. But if there was one, you could make a case that California was in a recession in 2022. And so why was California much more, predisposed to this post-COVID situation? Well, there's really two reasons. Well, there's a lot, but there's two main reasons. One is that California is a very expensive, high cost of living area. And what the post-COVID era brought in was this switch to remote work and the possibility of that, at least for a temporary period of time, right? So another thing it did is it led to an increase in demand for space as people spent a lot more time at home and wanted bigger homes, which also is very costly to do in California. So we really had an exodus and immigration out of California by a lot of workers that moved to other places. That's another reason why Texas actually did so well back then, because they were the receivers of a lot of this outflow of workers. And another reason why California didn't do so well in the post-COVID era was the Hollywood streaming entertainment industry. California and Holly and LA has always been the center of the entertainment industry. But over the last decade or so, and it really hit the fan after the COVID-19 pandemic, competition from other states that also were trying to produce video content and also competition from other countries, we've seen much higher quality production from outside the US that's led to more production elsewhere and less demand for entertainment coming from out of Hollywood. And the last thing I want to point out is that you actually see us now turning, right? You see us now growing fast in the US, and the expectation is that this is going to widen. So we're going to now go forward again, going back to our, rightful place of growing faster in the rest of the US economy. And this should not be a surprise considering we are at the, beginning of this new technological revolution with artificial intelligence, which has its center in the California economy. And so it's going to boost our economy much more than other parts of the US economy. Uh, Now here I want to look at the specific industries, how they fared for California as well as and here I posted for California, but this is also very representative for what's happening in the US more broadly. So most of this, even though the numbers will be slightly different, the intuition and the logic behind it actually also counts for many other states. And then I want to talk about specific policies and how they're affecting these different industries. And the first thing you should notice in this graph here is that you see that where we've had the most employment growth is in healthcare and social services. In fact, nearly all of our employment growth comes from healthcare and social services over the last year, and then on top of that, some in education. And then the other thing you should really, stand out in this picture is just the sheer number of industries that are either flat or have been contracting over the last year, right? So this is another signal to show that the U.S. economy is not in a particularly healthy state right now because there are so many industries that are contracting. And what's really keeping us afloat is just, one or two industries. And so, so what you'd really like to see is a more broad-based, durable growth across many industries. And first, I want to talk some of these growth headwinds we have in some of these, and I want to start out with immigration and deportation policies. And where we have a lot of workers that are either foreign born or undocumented, they are in the industries of, farming, of leisure and hospitality, social services, non-durable goods manufacturing, such as food processing facilities, and construction, right? And I know this is a very sensitive topic, and I'm not going to speak to that, but I do want to acknowledge that this is a sensitive, and all I can do as an economist is tell you what deportation policies have done in the past. We actually have a lot of scenarios and examples in the U.S. going all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1887, and then the Secure Communities policies during the first Obama administrations of deportations and how they affected the economy, in that entire time span. And what we really see is that the deportations actually raised the unemployment rate and reduced economic activity among the native-born population in the area where the deportations happened. So very counter to what the policies are actually supposed to do. And why is that the case? Well, there's really two dimensions to it. The one is that the people who are deported don't do the same types of jobs that the domestic labor force does. For instance, in construction, if you lose your undocumented workers that are all the roofers putting the roofs and the drywall on the housing, you don't have those, then you can't build a house. And then if you can't build a house, then you don't need the construction site managers and all the other workers that are also needed to build that house because the whole project is just not going to happen. And the other side of the coin is that these people who are being deported also add to demands to the economy, right? They make a living, they spend money in the economy, and when they're gone, they no longer do that. And so that also leads to downward pressure on economic activity in the economy more generally. And so, this new deportation policy is still very much in its beginning stages, and we obviously don't know where it's going to go and how much it's going to scale up beyond now. Uh, and it also means it's hard to see what the effect has been so far because it is so early, but we're doing a preliminary study at the Anderson forecast where we're looking across the 50 different California counties, 50 plus counties, and seeing that the counties where there's a higher proportion of foreign-born population, we are starting to see that those places are seeing a slightly higher rise in the unemployment rate at the time of these deportation policies are happening. Now, as I said, it's very preliminary. We don't have much data yet, and it's quite noisy. But this is one study that we're currently looking at, and so far it's looking like the current policies are very much in line. The implications of those policies are very much in line with what we've seen with past deportation policies. Um, Let me check the time. So I'm gonna go a little bit quicker here. The tariffs, they are affecting a lot of different industries just by making the cost of goods, a lot more expensive that we're importing. And so that's affecting, all the trade industries such as transportation and warehousing, wholesale and retail trade, and then also the manufacturing and construction industries, which use a lot of the imported goods, uh, for their production processes. And then turning to the more positive sign, which is that where we're going to have a lot of employment growth going forward, is because of both artificial intelligence and the reindustrialization policies, which we've had since the previous administration that really kicked them into high gear with the CHIPS Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really like a clean energy act for manufacturing of green energies or industries. And so what you see is that all of these policies are actually going to affect industries which have been declining recently, right? Professional and scientific services, durable goods, high-tech manufacturing, information services, and finance. And so why is it that all these policies are only affecting the industries that are really suffering so far? Well, the reason why these industries have actually been suffering is because of this pandemic overhang where we hired way too many people in the post-COVID-19 pandemic in these industries that are the frontier leading industries. And so we have been, laying off workers and gradually sort of getting back to normal from sort of a hangover, you could call it. But that's pretty much finished up now. And so in the future, with a lot new boost and demand into these industries, we should see these turn around again. And then lastly, I want to talk about the persistent weakness in the California housing market. And what I'm showing you here in the plot is total building permits over the 3-month average for Northern and Southern California. And what you see is that basically since the pandemic, we've had for Northern California actually a decline, but in Southern California, it's basically stagnating, right? So we're not seeing a lot of construction growth in the state. And the question is, why is that not happening? Prices are at an all-time high since the COVID surge in prices, and supply is low at the same time because nobody wants to move because they have very low cost mortgages relative to what a new mortgage would cost if they switch, right? So if prices are high and supply is low, well, why isn't everybody trying to build more homes to get a profit from that? And the reason is that there actually isn't very high profit to make right now, and that profit is very uncertain because first of all, building costs are high. That comes there's both long run reasons for that, such as very arduous regulations, but there's also recent reasons, such as the tariffs, which I just mentioned on the last slide. We also have that building supplies are very uncertain. This is very much part of the deportation and immigration policies, right? It's very hard to build a home if you don't know if your workforce is going to show up to work tomorrow. And then very importantly, lastly, is that, well, the main reason is that demand is very low. As people, sit on their low cost mortgages, they don't want to move because right now they'd have to get a very new expensive mortgage for a much higher priced house, and they just can't afford that. So that really means that there just isn't much incentive for home builders to build. And we actually, even though overall supply is low because people aren't selling their homes, new inventory homes is actually quite high. Right. And so if new inventories for new homes is high, they're actually trying to make deals, anything they can do possible to not have to lower the price too much in order to sell those homes. But it also puts a lot of downward pressure to build new homes that they're actually just sitting on a lot of new inventory already. Um, so I think I'm basically out of time. Let me just quickly uh, tell you the main thing to expect for 2026 that I haven't mentioned, which is that we're looking at a lot of fiscal stimulus coming in. And that's mainly because of the One Big Beautiful Act, right? That act extended the tax cuts and created new additional tax cuts, which is really going to juice up the economy over the next year. And in 2025 specifically, you could think of it as being actually a double juicing because the tax cuts are retroactive, which means that at the beginning of this year, you're going to get, or many people are going to get tax refunds that are larger than what they expect because they overpaid in taxes based on the 2025 tax schedule, which is going to be retroactively changed to the new tax schedule from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And then also, if the tariffs are overturned by the Supreme Court of the International Economic Powers Act, that's going to lead to a tariff refund of about $100 billion that needs to be returned to the businesses that paid those tariffs. And so that's also going to lead to stimulus there. Um, Now, as I mentioned earlier, just I very quickly want to give you the lay of the land. We do think unemployment is almost near its peak and it's going to come down after that because of all the stimulus coming in. We think inflation is going to continue to rise slightly, only moderately more, as the rest of the price effects and the tariffs are coming in. As I mentioned, that not all the consumers have been the businesses have been very reluctant to pass through those prices into the consumers, and so that's still going to be happening. Um, and we do expect after that GDP growth is also going to continue to grow robustly as it has through 2026 and 2027 based on this stimulus. So with that, I want to close up. I do want to mention that, again, we are in a very unstable time period, and because of that, the risks and uncertainties to this forecast are very large. We do not know how these deportation and tariff policies are going to unfold in the future. Federal Reserve independence has always been a worry for economists over the last year, but now it's really kicked into high gear after the criminal indictment of Chair Jerome Powell over the last weekend. And then there's also this, concern about these very elevated stock valuations and the frothy financial markets due to artificial intelligence, and whether that is in the bubble or not. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bohr. Appreciate the insight that you were able to share with us, and it'll definitely be some things that we consider through the rest of our conversations today. So again, good morning, everybody. I'm Darren Otten. I'm the superintendent president here at Copper Mountain College, and I'm been asked to facilitate a couple of things today, but I also wanted to give a little bit of background on kind of what we saw from the budget. And then, as you all are aware, we've got a conversation coming up with several leaders specifically from our system that are your peers so that each one of them can provide some context. So, as everybody's aware, last week Governor Newsom released his final budget for the 26-27 fiscal year. Excuse me. There's some big, broad priorities that were outlined throughout this particular item, but today we're obviously going to be focusing on how this impacts community colleges and make sure that we're all thinking about the various items that may impact our planning. And I think that's the big thing, especially with the uncertainty that Dr. Bohr noted on the out years. So again, the broader context for our budget situation here is that we've got relatively near-term stability from the perspective of this year. The administration is projecting strong revenues this year. There is a little difference between both the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office right now. Why that is probably is most likely due to timing and kind of the traditional discrepancies and projections that the two agencies ultimately make. But we also look at kind of the long-term pictures that do start to look at pretty large financial risks in the out years, 27, 28, 28, 29. But for the purpose of today's conversation, and specifically Governor Newsom's final proposed budget, a couple of notes that I want to highlight for everybody. And many of you may have seen Chancellor Christian's communication to the field and probably also reviewed the joint document that came out Friday between ACCA, ACBO, and the Chancellor's office. So a couple of key highlights. $240.6 million additional proposed resources for the student-centered funding formula, 87.2 million across 25, 26, and 26, 27 budget years for growth money. That's approximately 1.5%. An important one for those of us who've been carrying last year's deferrals. They are fully repaying those deferrals and settling up with everyone there. A cost of living adjustment of 2.41%, totaling 30.6 in ongoing dollars for certain categorical programs that are, it's noted though that right now that's EOPS, DSPS, CalWORKs, those type of things. There's a couple of other one-time investments that I think are also worth noting. And many of us are concerned about deferred maintenance, 120.7 million across the state, 100 million for student support block grant. Last year, if you all recall, there was 60 million this year for the student support block grant. They're proposing 100 million for this next year. 100 million for K through 12 dual enrollment initiatives, 36 million for ongoing data cloud platforms, some CPL money, etc. So what we're hoping today is that the panelists that we've got are reflective of the various roles that many of you hold across the system. And we're hoping that each one of them is going to be able to provide some context of what you might be able to think about, or what you should be thinking about, or what you're already thinking about from the perspective of your specific role in the system. So we're going to work through a couple of questions with each one of the panelists, and then, as was indicated before, we're going to then do a breakout session where each one of the panelists will be hosting a breakout. You'll be able to attend whichever one you're interested in attending, and ask some questions, share some thoughts, and those sort of things as we move forward. So with that being kind of the primer, the last thing I want to make sure everybody's aware of is kind of the process. And I think the process is important to note in this. I think most folks are aware that the January proposed budget is kind of the first kickoff of budget season every year that those of us in the community college pay attention to. So over the next couple of months, LAO, all of us, the advocacy folks, all of the things that ultimately kind of impact what will become known, what is known as the May Revise, ultimately will happen when we all collectively put pressure on the various places to ensure our voices are being heard. But it's not just us that are doing that at the state level, right? You've got K through 12 doing it. You've got every other organization in the state continuing to make sure that their voices are heard. And that's why it's so important we're all informed in this space. So once the May Revise comes out, that kind of just starts the last race, because statutorily, the state pretty much has to agree to a budget by June 15th for implementation on July 1. And so that's kind of the time frame that we're at right now. So with that, again, today's discussion is not about kind of predicting the final budget, but understanding how each one of the leaders that are joining us today are interpreting Governor Newsom's January proposal. So I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves real quick, and then we'll get started. Kuldeep, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Darren. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kuldeep Kaur. I serve as the Vice Chancellor of Administrative Services at the Yuba Community College District, and I'm just honored and privileged to be here amongst my peers on this panel to discuss the impacts of the governor's budget.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Jedi.
Thank you, Darren. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jedediah Lobos. I'm the Dean of Math, Science, and Engineering here at Antelope Valley College. You can call me Jedi or Jedi. So if you see the Star Wars mugs, don't be surprised. It is definitely an honor and a privilege to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jedi. Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane Kwan, Vice President of Student Services at Copper Mountain College, and I'm glad to be joining you all today.
Thank you, Jane. And Carla.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Carla Tweed. I'm the president of Kalinga College, and I am also just thrilled to be here with everyone.
Well, thank you all for, again, joining us. And helping shed some insight from each one of your perspectives in your roles about kind of your interpretation of the budget. And that's where we'll start this first question. And I'm going to lean on you, Jedi, to start this conversation. So, from your role, what is the most important signal that you've interpreted in the governor's January budget proposal, and what does it tell you about the state's expectations for community colleges, both for this year and the coming years?
So when I look at this and from where I sit, this very much looks like a hold steady. Uh, I see this as just, hey, let's not do anything crazy. Let's keep everything status quo because we don't know what's going to happen moving forward. We don't know what the economics are going to look like in the next few years. I think, though, after looking at all this and kind of going through it, what I worry about is that it's not going to really deliver on what Vision 2030 has laid out. And especially if we look at things like workforce development, and if we look at things like expanding, I don't know that this budget really does it if it holds the way it is, right? If it stays the way it is. So I see this really, it's really hard, especially as a STEM dean, because a lot of the programs that I deal with are going to lead to workforce, right? And so it's I look at it and while it's nice that there's all this really nice one-time money, I'm worried that there's not enough ongoing money to help to really drive these initiatives forward. So that's where I'm sitting right now.
Thank you, Jedi. Jane, how about your thoughts about what's going on?
I think that there's obviously a continued large focus and an expectation to enhance pathways to the workforce. And there is ongoing money, looks like, for credit for prior learning, which is great. My biggest thing with this budget is this sort of mixed message of a focus, but not a focus on student equity. And I say that because there's the additional support for the flexible student support block grant, like you mentioned, which is also great and helpful. But at the same time, the equity-based programs like Student Equity and Achievement (SEA) didn't get a COLA and hasn't had one in a while. And most of the programs that focus specifically on student equity populations didn't get an increase. So I just want to say that I hope there's if there's one thing, the most important thing is that I just want to say that I hope there is a continued expectation from the state to support student equity-based programming, in whatever form that looks like on our campuses, because I know they're all a little bit different.
Thank you, Jane. I definitely appreciate the thoughts in that particular space. Kuldeep, how about your kind of initial reaction from your role on the governor's budget?
Yeah, my initial reaction is there seems to be, dual message. The first message is commitment to stability for community colleges. When you look at the proposal to fully funding student-centered funding formula, there's $88.7 million. That could potentially help to eliminate a deficit factor in the current fiscal year of 25-26. And then obviously COLA, the way COLA is applied to student-centered funding formula, there's varying impact to districts depending on where they're at. If they are at the pre-pandemic level, then they're not going to earn because SCFF rates improve, but you got to see enough improvement in enrollments and metrics to be able to see to earn the COLA. And while there's temporarily short-term protections based on the governor's budget proposal, based on their revenue assumptions, there's concerns for long-term uncertainty and long-term sustainability because the governor's budget is based on optimistic views of the revenue and revenue projections, particularly around capital gains, coming from the stock market boost, and LAO is giving warnings to that. That's overheated, and that LAO was projecting an $18 billion deficit versus governor's budget is somewhat balanced with $3 billion in a hole. And so that really concerns me. So while, in closing, there's some level of stability for the upcoming year, there's concerns in the future years about stability for our system.
Thank you, Kuldeep. I definitely, I think the difference between the governor's proposal and the LAO's analysis is always interesting because there's always a difference in those projections, but this one seems a little large. Dr. Tweed, from your position, what are your thoughts?
I agree with all of my colleagues and all the points that they've touched on, and specifically, the LAO's projection compared to the governor's. I do believe there's a mixed message here. I think many of us are looking at this and going, okay, that's pretty. What's it really going to look like in May? Definitely the C funding. It's like they're moving and giving one-time funds to one that's even more restricted for equity versus, putting it where I think most of us use it for equity. And for me in particular, being a very small rural college, many of these things impact me on how I hire and who I can hire for my programs because of the 50% law. For those that don't know the 50% law, 50% of our budget have to be in instructional versus some of these categoricals. We have a little bit of leeway that kind of helps what we do. So unfortunately, many of the things that I'm looking at may not be for the best needs of the student, but how I can spend the money. And I don't think that's, a good optic to come from when we're talking about student success.
Thank you, Carla. So kind of talking about operational items, Jane, from again, your perspective, if this budget remains largely intact when we see May and ultimately adoption by July, where do you expect to feel the greatest pressure within the student services areas there at Copper Mountain as you kind of look towards your plans for this next year?
I think so many of our campuses lost funding from the federal government for programs like the HSI and APZ. The student support block grant, like we've talked about, I think that's there to help that. But like Jedi mentioned, with the ongoing funds, the one-time versus ongoing funds, those programs were ongoing programs. And the student support block grant, that's a one-time fund. And it's scary to try to support these standing programs that have been around for a long time with one-time funds. And I think that's the greatest pressure that will come it's from trying to support existing ongoing programs with one-time funds and trying to figure out where the money is going to come from to support these tapped out programs, like Carla mentioned, that we also use to support these programs without the increases that we see in the budget.
Jane, just a quick follow-up because obviously I know our budget pretty well. I think it's worth sharing with the rest of the folks in this room, what amount of resource that we have in the C dollars that we receive here at Copper Mountain College, not getting a COLA, that are available to even pay step and column this next year.
Right. It's a lot of personnel in there. And so it affects our ability to serve students because we all, there's regular increases with the salaries. And then how do we also serve students with those funds in the manner and in the way that we want to and we're supposed to?
Thanks, Jane. Kuldeep, how about you in the same kind of frame around operational budget pressures for this next year based on this projected budget?
Yeah, I want to also emphasize, for districts, when we have a collective bargaining agreement and when we're at the table negotiating with labor, those adjustments go across all of our employees despite the funding source. So yeah, obviously That's a pressure for many of almost all of our districts with Student Equity and Achievement Program, AMOJA, and APESI, and all of that, what my colleagues have shared here. In addition to this, one other concern that I have is not having enough growth funding. Our district has grown in enrollments, exceeding pre-pandemic levels, and we've seen our growth ranging from 7 to 10%. And when you look at the student-centered funding formula, the 3-year average growth is ranging around 4%. And so this 1% growth in addition to 0.5% that was allocated for the 25-26 year gives us 40 cents on the dollar. It's not really fully funding, and therefore it adds additional pressure on other operational areas or using one-time funding to earn a portion of the growth, and that leaves the district with a lot of unfunded growth, while we do have cost associated with adding an instructional capacity to meet our scheduling needs.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Carla, you want to share your thoughts?
Sure. I think that, Jane touched on this a little bit, with federal funding, and we heard from, Clement earlier about the federal funding and the loss of the funding that we're seeing in some of the grants that we've gotten. It's now, how do we take some of those one-time funds and backfill what we're doing? Because we know we can't stop doing it. These are students we're talking about. These are employees that we're talking about, when we're talking about those COLAs that, when we're at the negotiating table that Kuldeep talks about. I mean, these are all concerns that we're looking at because we're talking about people's lives and we want to do the best that we can for our students. I think one of the concerns that I have too, and this, I want to tread very lightly on here, but I do think that, we looked at the increase in Calbright, and overall, I think that hurts the districts. We're all doing online work, and singling out one of our institutions, to get this large budget. Some of that large budget that they're getting is I think your total budget, Darren, like for some of these smaller colleges. And I know that we're serving just as many students, if not more, and graduating just as many students, if not more. So I want to be careful on that one, but I do think that it hurts us in the long run to do something like that. The other thing that I see in this budget that I'm concerned with is the dual enrollment. This is a Vision 2030, and the dual enrollment increases to K-12, not to the colleges. And the colleges do a lot of work. Me in particular, I think I have about 20% of my FTEs are in dual enrollment, or sorry, not my FTEs, just my enrollment is about 20%. So some of these things concern me. Again, I know they're going to change in May, but just, the overall glance, I've got, a lot to think about on how I fund what we're doing out here.
Thanks, Carla. And so, Jedi, kind of just coming back to you on this one. Obviously, your role probably is closest to a student kind of operational things. And so, if this budget remains intact, where are you thinking you're already looking at the pressure concerns based on what's being proposed?
Yeah, I see two really big areas that are going to get hit hard, I think, if the budget stays the way it is. STEM is expensive, okay, really expensive. And I wish it were easy to scale labs the way you scale lectures, right? You can easily add 24 students into a lecture and teach them and still maintain the high quality that you're going to give. You can't do that with the lab. You've got safety considerations. I mean, that's the biggest thing right there. So, with the rising cost of materials to even run a lab, and the facilities. Now, I know that the budget mentions, I think, a one-time withdrawal from Prop 2, from the rainy day, which again, to me, is very problematic. I don't want to dip into my savings account one time. I'd rather say, hey, let's plan for, fixing things over time and make sure that it's maintained properly, as opposed to waiting for things to become dilapidated and then saying, okay, now we've got to do a much more costly thing 5 years from now. So I'm worried about how these labs are going to look. I'm worried about putting the right materials in there that students can use safely. Those kind of things are, I think, really big, especially in my area.
Thank you, Jedi. So as we kind of talk a little bit about the systematic growth, I know Kuldeep, you're dealing with growth at your institution. Many of us are, not all, but many of us are seeing some growth. The capacity, the existing capacity, Carla noted very eloquently that the 50% law concerns on a regular basis, we're having to make those trade-offs. From your perspective, Kuldeep, how does this proposed budget affect your ability to manage that enrollment growth, the needed staffing, program capacity, and then ensuring the quality that's needed for our programming?
Yeah, it becomes very difficult because there's really not any dollars tied to it. So, in looking at our numbers and running our numbers as I shared, you know, if the system received about 4% growth, then yeah, we could get some additional capacity to address those growth. And at what point do you turn away those enrollments and addressing access, challenges that we're facing in our local community? The other piece to this is the CBO perspective. Obviously, we need to grow enough to earn the cost of living adjustment to cover the total compensation for our employees. And so there's added pressure, obviously, from our because of the federal funding cuts and what it's done to categorical programs and all that. So, it's challenging for the district to have, just one-time funding to address the growth needs to build our instructional capacity. So, it's a perfect storm in terms of enrollment growth, right? But there's really not enough growth in the system to fund. So we have unfunded compensation. There's a lack of funding to address our equity and student support programs, etc.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Carla, how about your thoughts on kind of growth, capacity, trade-offs, those sort of things?
I don't know if I could say it any better than Kuldeep. We are back to pre-pandemic numbers. We're actually in growth right now. We already know we are going to have unfunded growth. So how much of that can we take on? What does that look like? As a college and a district, I'm part of a district. So it's one of those things, does, my sister college get to grow more, or do I get to grow more? Who's got the capacity for more growth? What does that look like? So those are really hard conversations because, as Kuldeep says, we're talking about students and the access to education that we want to provide. Where I am out on the west side on the Central Valley, low socioeconomics, low educational attainment rate. I don't ever want to say no to educational attainment. Like, it's really hard to look at some of these things and not be able to fund what we need to fund for our students.
Thank you, Carla. Jedi, how about your thoughts?
I think it's nice that there's some money, 1.5% over a couple of years for enrollment growth. It's just not enough. I think it's just too modest. And especially, again, if we go back and we're thinking about really expanding things like dual enrollment, like workforce development, 1.5% is just not going to cut it. And I mean, look, like it's not just STEM. I think all programs. I mean, the costs are front loaded. So here you go, and you're incurring all this cost in hopes of getting enough money later to cover. You can't 5 years from now say, oh, thank you for the money. Let me go back in my DeLorean and uncancel all these classes that I had to do, right? And so I think that's where it is. It's just it's funny how this question is framed as a growth question, because I feel like it should be an ungrowth question, right? There's nothing really happening there. It's going to remain kind of stagnant, I feel.
Thank you, Jedi. Jane?
I think that this budget makes it, and I think we've all alluded to it, it makes it tricky in managing, hiring, maintaining programs is, across the board, but in student services, definitely. And like I said, we have a lot of positions tied to these categorical programs that support students. Um, and as we all know, they have regular increases. So we'll hopefully continue to grow, and our budgets will hopefully grow in the future, but it's kind of tricky with the lack of with what's happening currently, and I think that that does compromise service to students. We'll always make a way for students, of course, but it is getting tricky. I do also want to mention dual enrollment, because a couple of us have mentioned that, and that was according, it's 55% growth in our system, right? And we're all working on it per Vision 2030, and we're all growing in that area. And our numbers are, it's about 20% for our numbers as well. And so, I do hope that something materializes there for the community college system, not just K-12, because we're putting a lot of effort into it. We're growing there, and we can't sustain and we can't continue to grow without funding for that, right? We have for us on our campus, we have a good system in place for dual enrollment. I could speak for that on the student services side. But as it grows without designated funding, like I said, if we can't add capacity, then we're compromising students in that area as well. And I know, like all of us here, we're all going to do everything we can not to compromise, quality and support and all of that. But some things like funding make that easier to do, instead of, just struggling to make ends meet like some of our colleges are doing.
Thank you, Jane. I think that that's kind of two things that are worth noting globally in this space. I think all of us collectively saw um, less than perfect efficiencies in class enrollment during the pandemic. And we were propped up by the system to be able to navigate that and allow that to happen. And so as we grew back, um, we've started to see our enrollments in our classes obviously fill to capacity. And now we're at this inflection point. We have really been the last year and a half, but I think a lot more of the system is feeling it this year, where we're having to add those sections. And the question is, are the waiting lists large enough to justify these things? Is the growth dollars there large enough to justify these things? I think that's a very important component as we kind of work to balance that. Um, the second part here that I think is worth noting, and Jane, you alluded to it, and everybody's kind of touched on it a little bit, specifically in Governor Newsom's budget, there's $100 million on the K through 12 side to support dual enrollment. And going back a couple of years, we received some outreach dollars that here at Copper Mountain allowed us to fund an outreach K through 12 counselor that specifically went to the counseling spaces. Well, those dollars no longer come to us, and we've not been able to institutionalize those dollars. And so we've been kind of braiding money and picking up pennies between the couch cushions and finding ways to keep this going. And yet, that investment carve out right now has been earmarked on the K through 12 side rather than our side. And so I think it's something that as we start thinking about where the advocacy is, specifically around kind of dual enrollment, to your point, Jane, I think there's an opportunity. So Jane, kind of going that way, let's talk a little bit about one-time funding and sustainability. So obviously really across our systems and across our colleges, but really heavily in student services, lots of programs, many programs have been launched or expanded using one-time funds. From a vice president of student services perspective, what is your biggest concern on some of these things as we talk about those one-time funds and the programs they're supporting?
I think that I've throughout these questions, I have expressed concerns with the one-time funding to support, especially ongoing, um, programs we lost or, to sustain our level of service. Um, I think that the biggest risk is for me, it's capacity, especially at such a small rural school like ours at Copper Mountain. We can't grow and sustain the level of service we want to with one-time funds because of our size. Just, our one-time funding tends to be really small. And, we have to braid funds to make programming work and to make programming happen on our campus. Because, sometimes our allocation isn't enough to fund, half a person. And so expect to grow, sustain, have a program, and it's a capacity thing that we have to braid funds. And then that's, an employee that has to wear multiple hats and try to do their best for students in all their hats, right? And so I think that the one-time fund is not stable. I wish that there was a way to, have ongoing funds for all of our programs because this is service to students and we're trying to serve students. And just specifically for a small school, we're trying to serve students at a small school with people doing multiple things and everybody kind of stretched thin. So I think that that's the biggest risk.
Thanks, Jane. Jedi, how about your thoughts on kind of the one-time funding and sustainability concerns?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk is program whiplash, right? So, here you go and you use the one-time funds, you set up these amazing things that we get to offer to students. Students get used to it. It becomes part of your institution. People talk about it, word spreads. Maybe you have that one student who has siblings who are juniors in high school. So they hear, oh, that's what I'm going to get when I get there. So they get here, and now you have to say, we don't offer it anymore. And don't get me wrong, I know we're going to try to keep things open, but the reality is, it just doesn't work that way. I think one of the hardest things that I've ever had to hear when I was a faculty member was, oh, they don't do that anymore. And it's so hard because you're going, okay, especially when you don't see any of this, when you don't know, when you're the student, you're just left wondering why have I been let down like this? And I think that's hard to be the student, of course. But then, of course, that it paints this really bad picture just overall, not to the governor's office, but to the individual college, to the districts, right? We're the ones who kind of get the blowback for that. Nobody says, hey, you guys should have looked at that governor's budget and done something about that in January or in May. Okay, so I think that's the biggest risk.
Thanks, Jedi. How about Carla? How about your thoughts on this?
Oh, one-time funding. It's kind of silly sometimes if you just, I don't know what else to add other than, you and I talked about this with the $60 million allocation for the nursing. Nobody's saying that nursing doesn't need it, but what funding is it coming from? It's coming from the bucket of strong workforce, and where we need additional buckets that can be spread over all of it instead of, I think, piecemealing from one to another is how I look at it, and it's just not sustainable.
Thank you, Carla. Kuldeep, I don't know if you have any thoughts in this particular space either.
I think it's really well said by all of my peers here. One thing that I'll note is, yeah, it's problematic, when we are relying on our ongoing programs with one-time funding. But that's what the state's been doing all along, right? There's optimistic revenue projections now for Proposition 98 that's going to create a higher settle up amount of $5.6 billion not only are we at the risk of losing whatever one time the governor proposed now, but also into the future ongoing funding stream. So it's greatly concerning that there's really not an allocation. The states kind of kick the can down the road, and that's very concerning for even ongoing needs.
Kuldeep, we'll actually stay with you, and just from your perspective, um, you've got kind of the crystal ball looking forward, trying to manage obviously a multi-college district finances. What would you suggest that ultimately um, you would change associated with an assumption or a priority in the governor's budget as we kind of work through the advocacy season here? So just for clarification on the question, if you could change one assumption or priority in the governor's budget to better support colleges and students, what would it be?
Well, I think one of my colleagues already shared it, and that's reallocating what's been proposed for Calbright College to our colleges in need. And I know it is probably a sensitive topic, but it's very well said that, a lot of our colleges are participating in the virtual campuses, and we've committed a lot of our resources. We're offering online course offerings. We do have a lot of students enrolled and taking up, and by giving additional $38 million to Calbright, that leaves 15 to 16 districts behind in funding and brings Calbright at this higher level, creating higher per student served ratio in comparison to our system, creating a disproportionate impact. I would say as a taxpayer, as a steward of our taxpayer dollars, if I had the magic wand, I would say I would rather see those resources come to, our traditional colleges that are supporting with online instruction, and we have been, and we're seeing a lot of growth in that area, and that there's a higher return on investment by putting resources there. What troubles me with this is also that there's colleges that are making efforts and they haven't really grown in their funding, and they're at the risk of losing funding, and they're not going to even earn COLA while there's allocation for Calbright for what's framed as additional costs for their startup.
Thank you, Kuldeep, for your thoughts. Jedi, how about you? If you could change one assumption or priority in the governor's January budget.
So I think it might be time to reform Title V, specifically the 10% FTS enrollment caps. We need, I feel like districts are getting punished for growing. So here you are, you're saying, okay, I'm really going to focus on workforce. I'm really going to focus on doing enrollment, and we're going to do what we're asked, what we're charged to do. But in doing so, you grow tremendously, but you only get reimbursed for a certain amount. And I think maybe they need to go to a system of either doing, higher of current year FTES or the 3-year average, because then you can really reward it. Now, I'm not saying remove a cap entirely, because you don't want any guardrails, but you certainly want to have it more reflective of what's going on. And if education, and I remember saying this when I first started in this role at a table in North Carolina. I was at a biotech thing, and I said, we need to change the way we're thinking about college, right? Because growing up, it was always, hey, stay in school so you can get a degree, so you can get a good job, so you can make more money. And really, it's go to school so you can learn a new skill, and it might not lead to a degree, but that new skill might lead to more money in your pocket. And if we put that out there, I think we're going to draw more people in. But if we draw more people in who say, yes, that's what I want to do, but then it costs the college in the long run, then there will be no college. So we need to be able to re-incentivize growing. And I think reforming Title V would be, I think, a first step.
Thank you, Jedi. Jane, how about your thoughts?
I think that as far as an assumption, I think that there needs to be an understanding that, especially with the cuts from the federal government, we lost ongoing standing funding that supports student equity, supports disproportionately impacted students. That understanding doesn't show, I think, with the lack of COLA to these programs and just the catch-all one-time fund. So if I could change one thing, it would be COLA for equity programs, but also keeping the one-time fund because that's helpful as well. So
I get you want the pie and to eat the pie. So I
yeah.
got you. Thank you for that. And I do think it is worth noting, I think under the context of kind
Hi,
of
Claudia. It's all right. Sorry. We can catch up later. No rush. Okay.
oh, hi there.
Okay, no worries.
So I guess it is worth noting that I do think that it is always interesting to see the priorities that are kind of revealed through this budget process and obviously, based on some of the equity conversations both at the federal level and the state level and what the Governor Newsom has chosen to include, I do think sends a message and it's one that I think we need to at least ask, what is the priority at this point? Carla, last word on kind of if you could change one assumption, one thing we need to fix associated with this as we look at the advocacy season and before we get the May revise, what is the crystal ball and the magic wand say for you?
I don't have just one, I have a list. But I think that Kuldeep and Jane hit on two of the big ones, Calbright and the allocation. I don't know what message that's sending to the rest of us that are doing the work in the same manner. And I also think that our equity funds and just the ongoing COLA for C, just like Jane and you talked about, you've got some unfunded positions coming up because of COLA increase that goes there, and we're bumping that. And it's not a good look. I think that if we can get COLA for that or the increase of the one-time funds into that instead of into another pot that's even more restrictive, it doesn't make sense. And I don't know if there's that understanding of what we're trying to do with the C funds.
Thank you, Carla. And thank you, panelists, for taking the time to kind of share your perspective. And I'm going to transition us here in just a second to what kind of our opportunity for each one of you who's attending today to really engage with your peers on these conversations. Each one of these panelists is going to help facilitate a conversation so that you all can get engaged with. When you each registered, there were several core themes that kind of emerged from that registration process where you were uneasy about something or you're thinking about something. And many of those themes, I think, were mentioned by many of our panelists today. But if there are specific things that as you engage in the breakout room that you choose to go to, please ask those questions, engage with your peers, because that is the one thing that I'm going to tell you and hammer down with ACCA. We have changed the format of this particular program and trying to be both time sensitive to you all, but also still give you an opportunity to engage with people who have similar jobs with you and looking at exactly kind of the space and places that you each have to work and execute in. So with that, I'm going to ask Alex. Ask Alex. I should have never have done that. To send us into some breakout rooms that each one of our panelists will be hosting.
All right. There are 4 breakout rooms labeled with the panelist names, self-select. So please, panelists, go into your own breakout room and then attendees choose where you would like to go. We have until 11 o'clock and then you can room hop as well too. I'll be out here to place anybody if they need help. And good luck with your budget questions. All right, panelist at the bottom, can you go into your breakout room? You should be able to select it yourself.
Alex, I'm not seeing anything.
I don't see one either.
Okay, let's see. Let's make it, oh, because I have to open rooms. That would be super helpful. There we go. Mentor program watch party. I am going to move y'all in Kuldeep's room coming up right now. Kuldeep, I can put you in your room. There we go.
This is Dan Walden. Can you put me in Carla's room?
I can.
Thank you.
Dan, what was your last name one more time?
Walden.
Okay. If anybody else would like me to assign a room, just speak up and I'll be happy to assist.
This is Iris. Can you put me in Kuldeep's room? Because I
I
don't see the
can.
screen to do that for myself.
I can. I'm moving you now, Iris.
I got it, Alex.
Okay, thank you.
This Willie, can you put me into Carla's room?
I can.
Thank you, Alex.
Alex, this is Julia. Can you put me into Iris's room? I'm sorry, Kuldeep's.
Yes. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Hi, this is Rachel. Can you put me into Kuldeep's room?
I can.
And Mark Fields in Carla's room.
Eric Harnish in Carla's room, please.
Yes.
Thanks.
Let's see. Eric, there we go.
Alex, if I pop into a room, can I pop back out?
You can.
Kuldeep has a lot of folks in there.
She does. I was just looking at that. We only have 8 people who are not assigned, but that's also included you, Darren, and I.
I'll go check in Kuldeep's room, come back out.
Okay. The breakout rooms have I'm gonna close them.
I'm getting to my desk right this second. Sorry about that.
Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the breakout rooms. I closed them, and I know it's always abrupt. Someone was probably in the middle of a really great question and answer. We're going to take a quick break and come back and regroup at 11:10. So if you just want to take a few moments and soak in all the good number conversation, we'll be back very soon.
Thanks, Alex.
Welcome back, everyone. It's 11:10. Darren, are you on and hearing me now?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
So as we wrapped up this, first of all, I want to thank all of the participants who joined some of the breakout rooms. I checked in with a few of the facilitators over break, and uh, along with the room I was in, was some great conversations. And I think that one of the things that I want to kind of note here that I think was really important. One of the participants in our room, Kelly Corias, I believe is her last name, kind of closed up our session with, we may not all have all the answers at this point. And I think that's kind of the common theme about all of us at this point in the budget cycle. We don't know the answers. We don't know exactly the impacts yet. We're trying to figure out, navigate, and plan. But that's why we're all here together today, because we need to start these conversations and continue moving this forward. And I just really do appreciate ACCA and the staff for putting this on and giving us this opportunity. So with that, I think that the one thing left here with the facilitators, if there's anything that was an aha that came out of the conversation that any of you would like to quickly share before we move into the advocacy strategy, I'll give you the opportunity to do that right now. So, Khalid, Carla, Jedi, Jane, anybody have any thoughts they want to share that came from their breakout rooms?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead, Jane.
Okay. I'll share something in our group. I think we're experiencing similar struggles on all of our campuses, especially with SEA. So it was unanimous as far as advocacy. COLA for SEA was the determination there. So that's all I want to say from our group.
Thank you, Jane. Khalid?
Yeah, I'll just add on to that, Jane. In addition to that, our group had an advocacy interest for strong workforce, COLA, applying COLA. Since the inception of strong workforce, there's not been COLA applied to it at all. And then there are districts that are obviously, growing. And so there was an interest for seeing additional growth funding, and then reallocating Calbright's allocation for either growth or base, because if it's allocated for base, then it allows for those districts that are not even earning COLA to have a portion of that funding.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Carla, Jedi, any final thoughts before I turn this over to Sarah?
Yeah, just real quick. No big aha moments, but very much an echo of what we already discussed. And this kind of both the patch, what feels like a patchwork of one-time funding versus something that's more ongoing, especially when it comes to student services, and also the issue of deferred maintenance on and what you have as far as the status or the what your buildings look like, what your facilities look like, right? So it's a lot of what we talked about, and so I think there's going to be a big. I think we're all kind of waiting to hear what does advocacy look like.
And I'll just wrap that up, Darren, if you don't mind, with the group that I was in. I think the number one thing that we all talked about was we have to have funding for growth. We're talking about students here. And, we touched on Calbright too. And I think one of the things that we touched on in my group too, that I think I need to get my stuff to Larry, is dual enrollment and how we fund dual enrollment at the college and what it actually costs us to do that at the college and what that looks like. So I think that's it from my group.
Well, I just want to take one last thank you to all of the breakout facilitation leaders, the impact conversation panelists. I just really appreciate you all helping out inform the field, and appreciate your time and effort and energy. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sarah to introduce the advocacy strategy folks.
Thank you, Darren, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with us as we move through our agenda. As Darren mentioned, the next session is the advocacy strategy presentation. Today, we have Andrew Martinez, Senior Director of Government Relations from the Community College League of California. We also have Kyle Highland. He's the Director of Government Relations from School Services of California. And David O'Brien, Vice Chancellor for Government Relations at the California Community College Chancellor's Office. So I want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us today to share the impacts to colleges from both state and federal initiatives from your respective viewpoint. We do greatly appreciate you having you here. And now I will pass it over to our panelists to get started.
Hi. I don't know. We didn't really do a Rochambeau on who's going to go first. So, Kyle, I'm happy to jump in, or if you want to walk through however you want to go. And David, I guess
you're already talking, Andy. So go ahead and lead us off.
Okay. Well, I'm Andy Martinez, the Senior Director of Government Relations for the Community College League. Thank you so much for being here. It sounds like what you guys talked about in your small groups is what we're hearing consistently from the field as well when it comes to issues that we want to advocate for when it comes to investments in the governor's budget. We are very appreciative of the governor's budget. First of all, it's tremendously supportive of what we're trying to do. There are some things that we're trying to figure out here and there as we go forward, but in general, I think we are very much appreciative of the COLA and that it's consistent with what K-12 is receiving. We are also appreciative of the growth. We will, I think, when we take our agenda, our talking points to our board at the legislative conference here at the end of the month, I think we're going to be elevating, is the growth enough? Can we add more money to fund growth? Because we are building back our student enrollment. The governor's document for when he releases his budget, the Department of Finance, really highlights the fact that we've built back our enrollment as quickly as possible and met what the legislature administration asked us to do. That requires us to have more funding for growth. So we're really going to lean in onto that as well. We're also going to raise the issue again of this 1 year versus 3 year average for calculating your enrollment. You know, the idea was the 3 year was to ensure that if there's a downturn in your students and on your calculation of your formula, it wouldn't hurt your district. But as you're growing back, it might actually harm your district because you're not seeing the immediate growth that you saw from 1 year to the other. This is being blended out over 3 years. And so there is an idea that's been floated by the Chancellor's Office, and I think it does resonate with our districts that you should be able to choose either a 1 year or 3 year average for that space. Additionally, when it comes to the calculation of your growth, there's a cap of 10% in place right now. So you cannot get more than 10% of your growth. So if you have 11% growth, you're out of luck. And so we're also going to probably flag that as an issue for us to talk about is why not go above 10% if we're building back enrollment from as fast as possible? Why not go there at that space? Deferred maintenance, we're really appreciative of the investment of the deferred maintenance, but recognize that even if you were to divide $120 million by 115 colleges, that's not going to go very far. So we're probably going to flag that as somewhere that maybe they could consider doing investments. We are appreciative of the fact that it's there in the first place, though, because some years it has not been there in that space. The categoricals receiving a COLA, again, I think that's an issue of concern for us. It's only select categoricals that will receive a COLA. And as was mentioned by some of your breakout groups, the student equity and achievement, not one of the groups that gets a COLA. There is a block grant that's there, and that's great. It's $100 million for that, and that's wonderful. But that's one-time money. And as we're talking about, there's not a COLA, and there has not been a COLA for the C program in the last 4 years. If you're counting this budget year as one of the years. So putting money there as a COLA is also something we're talking about. Strong workforce is also something that has been discussed a lot by our CEOs as well. Taking the money for the nursing, we are appreciative of that, but recognizing that that's taking away from the other programs, the strong workforce programs. And so the Chancellor's Office in their shared advocacy from last year suggested backfilling money in one-time dollars of $60 million to ensure strong workforce was robust in strength going forward for the next 3 years. And so we probably will continue to echo that message too as well. I think you guys mentioned potentially providing a COLA for strong workforce, so a modest change in our approach on that as well. And then buying down the deferrals, we're really appreciative of that fact. I think no one's really sure what the future is going to hold for us. We're still trying to figure out the $18 billion deficit that the Legislative Analyst Office projected versus the Department of Finance's $2.9 billion deficit. Looking at the LAO's initial comments on why there's some significant difference between the two, they're looking at the stock market, and they're a little worried about what the out years will look like, and they're just not sure that that's reflective in the governor's budget necessarily. I think there's also this issue of the settle up that I don't know if you've talked about that in your space this morning yet as well, but there's basically about $5.6 billion that should go to Prop 98 that's been parked by the administration because it's not necessarily, in their perspective, it's not necessarily guaranteed that those dollars will come to us. It's kind of a projection. Until the projection is real, they don't want to make that part of the universe of Prop 98 purposes. So by doing that does give them some additional flexibility on the non-98 side of the budget to address some issues of concerns for them. So I'm not sure that how this is all play out. I know our K-12 partners are also equally concerned about the settle up and parking this money in this space here as well. I think you're going to hear a lot about that in the coming months about whether or not this is the appropriate machination to move forward. But it does give the governor additional flexibility on the non-98 side. So that will be something that you're going to hear a lot about. The other issue I'll raise, and then I'm sorry, Kyle, if I took everything you wanted to say, I apologize very much in advance. The other issue I want to raise with you, that just to flag for your attention, is last year there was the taking away of or reducing the amount of funds that come to our colleges for the transitional kindergarten, and they initially proposed it to be retroactive or back in time. And now it's going forward at this point. But there was a part in the Legislative Analyst Office analysis talking about the split. Is it the right spot for the split to go forward? We're seeing growth in the way our community colleges are taking students, partly because of dual enrollment, partly because of returning adults in those places. And they're potentially seeing a downswing in the attendance of K-12, partially because of population trends and so forth. So I think we want to have a longer conversation about that issue as well going forward, about the methodology on that space. I think the Senate might be interested in having this conversation about whether the split is the right space for us going forward. There was $100 million that was allocated in the governor's budget for dual enrollment, but it's on the K-12 side. That's a vague reference in the budget about that issue. It'll be revealed in the trailer bill language on February 1st-ish, what their thinking is on that language. So right now, all we have is just a quick line on the dual enrollment investment for $100 million to encourage more K-12 partners to get into that space as well, which I don't think is going to be something that the legislature is going to be terribly shy about getting engaged with. There's a recent article about the University of California. The bulk of their students are now trying to get in and out in 3 years and saving themselves a significant amount of debt because going to UC in Berkeley or UCLA, not cheap, or Santa Barbara or San Diego is not cheap when it comes to housing and other costs associated with that. Those are going to be students that are probably doing AP courses, but a lot of students doing dual enrollment as well. So I think that there's going to be a lot of excitement to encourage more dual enrollment in the future as well. So that's kind of the big picture of what we're thinking about when it comes to our priorities. But again, we're still getting closer to that final line of having our talking points ready to go out to the field. And we'll put those before the ACL committee on January 24th, I think it is. And then January 25th, our 24th and 25th, our CEO boards of trustees will give us guidance on whether or not we hit the mark on our talking points, and we'll distribute those to the field after that point going forward for our legislative conference that takes place at the end of January.
All right, thanks, Andy. I guess I'll go next. So Kyle Highland, Director of Governmental Relations at School Services of California. Additionally, I also am one of the legislative advocates for ACCA, myself and Michelle McKay Underwood, who also works at School Services of California. So really, I want to focus, these initial remarks around, again, some of the proposals in the governor's state budget proposal, and what historically ACCA has supported in this budget proposal, and also some of the things that we may have some more concerns about. I think that supporting the fact that the budget is focusing on funding core programs during volatile economic times is important. So we're appreciative of that. When you look at the non-98 side of the budget, it's a lot more of a mess. We have we call Prop 98 a double-edged sword in the sense that we have a guaranteed funding minimum at the K-14 level, whereas the non-98 side of the budget, it's a lot more volatile on their funding. The double-edged sword is, the legislature tends to fund us at the minimum and uses it as a floor, a ceiling instead of a floor. But we are appreciative that there's no proposed cuts, there's no proposed deferrals. In fact, Andy talked about how the deferral from the 2025 Budget Act is proposed to be paid off, so we are very supportive of that. Supportive of the COLA being applied to the student center funding formula and categorical programs. We agree from other previous speakers about the budget, as well as Andy, that we would like to see more categorical programs get that COLA applied to, specifically the equity programs that aren't in there. So that's something that we'll likely be advocating for down the line. And then we are appreciative of the enrollment growth. Obviously, districts have seen a pretty significant bounce back since COVID-19. So we're seeing districts bounce back in terms of their enrollment. It's nice to see that the governor's budget proposal acknowledges that those districts are bouncing back. So we will be supportive of the 1.5% of enrollment growth that they're proposing over the 2025, 26, and 26, 27 fiscal years. It was nice to see that after several years of no funding for deferred maintenance, that the governor is proposing to provide 121 million in preferred maintenance. Again, as Andy mentioned, it's not much money when you divide it amongst all the colleges in the system, but it's nice to see that as a starting point that they're providing that funding. So obviously that's something that we'll be supportive of, but asking for a little bit more of an increase, so it could be divided, so some districts could have more money for their deferred maintenance pot. Also excited to see that the next round of Proposition 2 funds are going out, that the governor is proposing that. So that's good for folks that are receiving those dollars. The student support block grant, it's nice to see that the governor is proposing that in his January budget, because if you recall, last year there was no block grant for community colleges. There's only one on the K-12 side. I think we did some advocacy. Everybody here on this call did some advocacy saying, hey, if K-12 is getting a block grant, we want one as well that's flexible and we can spend on our district's priorities. So it's nice to see that not only is the governor providing that, but it's 100 million rather than the 60 million that ended up being in the 2025 State Budget Act. So that is something we'll be supportive of. Again, we assume that block grant will likely look very similar to the one that was included in the current year budget, but we'll have to wait till trailer billing, which comes out in February, to know that for sure. I think in terms of areas of concern, I think our biggest concern is this second year that the governor is proposing this settle up. And again, Andy went a little bit into that, but again, last year, in last year's budget, there was a $1.9 billion settle up, in the sense of they withheld $1.9 billion of the guarantee for 2024-25 until they saw the revenues come in for it. Now, this year in the budget proposal, they're proposing to pay off the $1.9 billion, which is good news. But we're disappointed to see that this seems to now be a trend, that they're using this budget tool at their disposal to really, you can see it as almost a budget balancer on the 998 side of the budget. And not only are they using it for the second year in a row, but it's almost 3 times the amount that they did for the 24-25. So they're proposing a $5.6 billion settle up for 2025-26. So, they're doing it that method because they don't want to do it through the Prop 98 suspension method, because that creates a maintenance factor obligation and it locks in a lot of those rates. So that is something that we are concerned about, for the community college side, but also I think our K-12 partners will be allies in trying to talk to the legislature about, making sure that all the funding that's supposed to go to Prop 98 does go to Prop 98. I think the uphill battle will be, they've already used this tool once. And so it's going to be, it might be difficult to convince them not to do it this year, especially when you look at some of the medical costs on the non-98 side of the budget, that they're trying to make sure that they don't have to cut on that side of the budget as well. So that's why we see this little mechanism that they're doing. So really, what I foresee ACCA asking is to support the fully funding obligation under Proposition 98 and oppose any proposal to fund below the required minimum guarantee for K-14 education. So that's something that we'll be talking to the administration and lawmakers about. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess, the overall from our first initial look at the budget in terms of ACCA, and the priorities we'll be talking about with lawmakers in terms of what we support and what we have concerns on. That is our first little look at it.
Well, I think that means I'm next. Apologies for logging on a couple of minutes late, but hello, everybody. Great to see you all. I'm David O'Brien. I'm Vice Chancellor for External Relations at the State Chancellor's Office in Sacramento. I work with Executive Vice Chancellor Chris Ferguson directly, as well as I want to acknowledge my colleague Imran Majid, who is here, who serves as our Director of Fiscal Advocacy. So great to have you on. Thank you, ACCA, for putting this on and inviting us as always. We always look forward to the forum at this time of year. And I just want to say, on behalf of the Chancellor's Office and Chancellor Christian, we're very pleased to see the directions the governor proposes to take in this budget. It is overall, on the whole, has a lot of positive things that we're very supportive of for the California community colleges. Many of the things that Kyle and Andy have already echoed. So COLA for apportionments, growth funding, that is significant. We obviously would like to see, full growth funding and lifting the cap, which we have supported in our approved budget requests by the Board of Governors. So we will continue to include that in our advocacy and discussions with the legislature. We are also very supportive of some of the one-time targeted investments the governor proposes to make. So the Chancellor and the Chancellor's Office continue to prioritize a synchronized and consistent and real-time data infrastructure. And so the governor's proposed target investments of some one-time funding to scale up the Common Cloud data platform that's already underway is great to see, because we want to make sure that we're integrating things like e-transcripts, mapping articulated pathways, program pathways mapper. We know that those are significant investments to helping students earn the credits they need and achieve their goals in a reasonable manner, their educational goals. Another investment that we're very supportive of, that I think everybody probably knows is a longtime priority of Chancellor Christian's in this office, as well as the legislature's, is credit for prior learning. So the governor's budget proposal does include mostly one-time funds, $35 million, to continue to scale up our credit for prior learning initiative. I'll also note, we're grateful for student support block grant funds. We've heard, consistently from colleges, particularly over the last several months, in the face of federal uncertainty and increasing student concern, changes to, some of the federal benefits programs, that having flexible block grant dollars to support students can be a strong tool. So we look forward to that as well. The dual enrollment investment, obviously very significant. We view that as something that is an investment in the state that saves money, down the road when it comes to students going to UC or CSU, right? Because those are courses that they can take in dual enrollment. The goal of 12 units by the time a student graduates high school is hugely significant. I want to also just note additional funding for the Chancellor's Office is something that we're very supportive of and prioritize. Those of you that have worked with us in terms of contracting know that that is something that we have to rely on extensively as a small office of just 200 or so authorized staff overseeing our large and very diverse system. And so the additional funding in the governor's budget to create a dedicated contracts unit at the Chancellor's Office will really help streamline a lot of our processes for ensuring that we can contract with external partners. And lastly, again, hugely important, the addition of a new attorney to our General Counsel Office that would monitor changes at the federal level and advise the General council accordingly. So, it's a classic case of, did we get everything we want out of the budget? No, we never do. We will continue to advocate for things, again, many of the things that our partners at ACCA and the League have already discussed. We'll continue to advocate for greater funding for enrollment growth, for lifting that cap, for the COLA to apply to all categoricals. It's a major priority of ours. We'll continue to advocate for even more funding around things like deferred maintenance, right? Because again, as Kyle noted, $120 million is significant, but doesn't really scratch the surface of what the system needs. And we will obviously continue to advocate for sufficient resources for things like part-time faculty office hours and health insurance. But other than that, I'm just pleased to be here and happy to engage in this discussion.
Thank you. Given the time that we have, do any of our participants have any questions? Any questions for our panelists, folks? You can put them in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, well, sounds like you guys gave us all the information that we needed this morning. So thank you, appreciate it. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I'm gonna see if Jesse is hiding in the background anywhere.
I am here. Thank
Okay,
you,
Jesse.
Sarah.
Back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And again, thank you to all the facilitators for joining today's Budget and Advocacy Forum. I don't have a whole lot. I just want to make sure I give folks another opportunity to ask questions before we close this forum. I just want to wait just for a moment, just in case somebody wants to ask a question or make a statement. Well, without seeing any raised hand, I just want to say thank you so much again for joining us today. Darren said this earlier today. This is a new format that we have pivoted to. You will get an email soon to ask about your experience. Please complete the survey questions. Please provide us with your thoughts, what worked, what could be improved, and how we can make this better for future years. Again, this is an opportunity to just get some initial ideas, right, in terms of how the governor's proposed budget might impact, us at the district college level and how we can continue to do the work that we do. So this is a great way to start the year. I'm glad that, the impact, I think, will hopefully be minimal to us at the community colleges. And again, thank you for all that you do at your respective college and district. We have so much to do to serve our students. And again, I just so very grateful that you're here today. Please fill out the survey. Again, we want to make sure we listen to our members. We listen to what you want us to do differently next time. Again, years ago, we would meet in person at the convention center to talk about, right, the proposed budget, the impact. And this time around, right, we're doing it on Zoom. So if this format works, we'll continue to do this. And if the timing is perhaps something we could consider to perhaps do it in 5-6 weeks, perhaps, once the information gets rolled out more, once decisions get made at the college district level, perhaps we could have a conversation again sometime in early March. That's another option. So again, we just love to hear from you. And again, please thank you in advance for completing the survey. I want to thank Alex Coretti one last time. Thank you, Alex, for again handling all the behind the scenes. We have, I believe, at least a few watch parties. So thank you, folks, for getting your folks involved and joining this advocacy and budget forum. Again, it's great to see lots of you across the state on this call. And certainly, I want to acknowledge again Darren Otten and Sarah Schrader again for really making this happen. And again, we have great insights from Kyle Hyland, from Andy Martinez, and David O'Brien. Thank you again so much for sharing how we can advocate as as you know, at the end of the day, it's always about advocating for our students, advocating for our colleges, advocating for our districts, advocating so that, again, the governor's budget will, again, do what we need to do to continue to serve all of the students in our communities. So without further ado, I just want to say thank you so much. We will wrap up this session. I'll give you your 20 minutes back. For the folks who didn't join earlier, we are going to have an email to share this recording with you. So you will get a recording just in case you want to watch this again and share with your colleagues. But again, thank you. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Thank you so much. So I'll turn to Alex to close the.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, panelists and advocates and ACCA president and all of the people. I'll be in contact soon and have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jedediah. Thank you. Thank you, Carla.